A former Massachusetts police officer is now in the hot seat, facing federal charges of murder in the death of his pregnant girlfriend, Sandra Birchmore. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. Matthew Farwell is accused of grooming Sandra starting when she was only 13 years old, having sex with her when she was underage too. After that, Farwell is accused of getting Birchmore pregnant before murdering her and staging the death as a suicide. The case was back in federal court just this week, and according to a judge, the trial date could be just around the corner. But before we dig deeper into the latest updates in this case, let's head back to the beginning. That takes us to 2011, when Sandra Birchmore was only 13 years old. That was the same year that she joined the Explorers program with the Stoughton Police Department in Massachusetts. This program was supposed to be a safe way for kids to learn about the criminal justice system. So they would meet with officers for mentoring and even get hands-on experience in a controlled and safe environment. But according to allegations, it wasn't the safe space it was supposed to be for Sandra. During her time in that program, she got to know a few Stoughton police officers, Matthew Farwell, his twin brother William Farwell, and another officer, Robert Devine. Several officers allegedly began grooming Sandra right around this time, but it was really Matthew Farwell, the defendant in this case, who took the first step. This is straight from the affidavit, quote, "This grooming culminated in Farwell raping Birchmore in April 2013 when she was only 15 years old. At the time of this assault, Farwell was 27 years old." Investigators found some journal entries Sandra had made about all of this too, and some text conversations. In one instance, Sandra writes, "Had butterflies so bad the day you took my virginity." Farwell replies, "Me too, it was such a big day." Birchmore says, "Still know the date to this day." "Really?" he replies. "Yes," she says. He sends back a smiley face. Sandra Birchmore then says, "That's not a date I'll ever forget. It was April 10th, 2013. Smiley face from Farwell. Birchmore replies saying, "Best day of my life," with a face and heart emoji. Farwell replies, "Me too." This comes up again on June 19th, 2020. Birchmore writes, "I'm glad you agreed to take my virginity though." And Farwell agrees, writing, "Me too." He then says, "LOL, if I pushed, I absolutely could have effed you without condoms from day one." And Birchmore says, "Probably if you really pushed it." This next part comes from Sandra, and it's so heartbreaking. She writes, quote, "I was kind of scared to say no in the beginning, not knowing how you'd take it. So yeah, you would have gotten no condoms, LOL." According to prosecutors, Sandra's relationship with Matthew Farwell continued well past 2011. They continued to talk, meet up, and have sex, sometimes when Farwell was allegedly on the clock, still working for the Stoughton Police Department. This allegedly would happen in his police vehicle in public parking lots like Five Guys or Costco. There's allegations that another Stoughton police officer also had sex with Sandra in his car, and that Matthew Farwell's twin brother, William Farwell, also sent her explicit texts. But it seems that the relationship between Sandra and Matthew Farwell was the most intense and continued well past her 18th birthday. According to court documents, Sandra wanted to get pregnant with Farwell. She even sent him pictures of her ovulation schedule. After that, Sandra apparently gave Farwell an ultimatum: that they have unprotected sex with the intention of conceiving a child, or she would tell Farwell's wife about their relationship. Right now is a really good time to tell you that at the time of Sandra Birchmore's death, Farwell was married. His wife was pregnant with their third child, and just hours after Farwell last saw Birchmore and allegedly murdered her, his wife gave birth. At the time of Sandra's death, she was pregnant too, something that she announced to Farwell on December 28th, 2020. But after that, Farwell's personality apparently changed. Before she died, Sandra told at least 3 people that Farwell was physically violent with her when they discussed her pregnancy. On January 3rd, 2021, one of Birchmore's friends called the Stoughton Police Department and referenced a sexual relationship between Matthew Farwell and Sandra Birchmore. His response was of extreme anger, sending texts like, quote, "Why would she call and drop my effing name, Sandra? Like, what do I have to do with you not giving her something?" But by all accounts, Sandra was really excited for her upcoming baby. She had already bought some new baby clothes and even booked a maternity photo shoot. According to her friend, she was really happy to have this baby. And after a while, Matthew Farwell seemed to have those feelings too. The week of January 24th, 2021, he went over to Sandra's apartment and showed particular interest in her closet and bathroom. According to court documents, officials believe that Farwell's shift in demeanor on or about this date was his attempt to appease Birchmore until he could kill her. Part of that plan included asking Birchmore to give him a key and keep it secret. Another part of that plan was inspecting various rooms of Birchmore's apartment, including the closet, to determine whether they contained items or presented options for how and when to kill Birchmore, which allegedly happened on February 1st, 2021. According to court docs, security camera video from Birchmore's apartment shows her picking up a DoorDash order at 5:01 p.m. on February 1st. 4 hours later, Matthew Farwell arrives. He's seen entering through the main door and going up the elevator. But less than an hour later, Farwell is seen leaving Sandra's apartment. Investigators believe he was the last person to see Sandra alive. On February 4th, a wellness check was called in and first responders found Sandra's body in her apartment. This next part is very important. Sandra was found seated with a duffel bag strap around her neck, wearing the same clothes she wore on February 1st, the same day Farwell came to visit. Initially, Birchmore's death was ruled a suicide. The medical examiner noted that her hyoid bone was broken. That's a U-shaped bone at the front of the neck. It's become a major part of this case too, because even though an ME originally said Birchmore had died by suicide, a broken hyoid bone isn't indicative of a suicide. According to the affidavit, fractures of the hyoid bone are more commonly seen in strangulation assaults and in hangings with full body weight applied to the ligature, but not seated hangings. Federal investigators now say Sandra was murdered and they believe Farwell killed her. Last year, Matthew Farwell was indicted by a grand jury on the charge of killing a witness or victim. The indictment reads in part, quote, Matthew Farwell did kill Sandra Birchmore, a person known to the grand jury with malice and aforethought, willfully, deliberately, maliciously, and with premeditation, and with the intent to prevent the communication by any person to a law enforcement officer of information relating to the commission or possible commission of a federal offense. Matthew Farwell denies any involvement in Sandra's death and has pleaded not guilty. But just this week, the case was back in federal court where a judge noted both sides need to prepare for an upcoming trial date. Both the defense and prosecution made note of the voluminous amount of evidence in this case, saying they're still working to exchange evidence and information with each other. The government specifically noted its plans to review protocol for examining any devices that could have privileged information on them. But what does all of this mean, and where is the case headed from here? For that, we're going to bring in former federal prosecutor Nima Rahmani. Nima, thank you so much for coming on with us today. And I wanted to start with the newest info we have, that a federal judge has said, prosecution, defense, you guys get ready. A trial date will soon be set. So from the prosecution side of things, what does that look like? Are they wordly preparing for what's ahead?
I think so, Sierra. Let's not forget this case was supposed to go to trial last year in September, and the defense said they wanted more time. They even agreed to voluntary detention. So you would think that the government is ready to go. Obviously, a very high-profile case. Anytime you're dealing with a murder, the chances of it pleading out are less because you can't really give much of a discount, especially in a case like this where the allegations are that someone killed their pregnant girlfriend.
Something that was mentioned at a hearing just this week, too, is that there's so much evidence. I believe they said a voluminous amount of evidence. I know you had mentioned that you think both sides are prepping and pretty well prepared, but do you think that goes into all of it, just the sheer amount of evidence they have to go through?
I think so. And when you're talking about the evidence, it's really that electronic evidence. We're talking about years of text messages dating back to when the victim was as young as 15 years old. That really shows that relationship, right? The motivation for the murder. So when you have a lot of digital evidence and you're dumping it, you want to make sure that obviously it's produced in its native form, it's all authenticated. But obviously people are texting all sorts of people. And in a case like this, you might even be texting your lawyers. You want to make sure all that privilege information is removed and everything that you are producing is indeed relevant to the case.
You talked about privileged information, and that's something we heard in the hearing as well, that prosecutors were looking for the correct protocol to make sure when they're reviewing privileged information that they're doing it correctly. You mentioned, obviously, privileged information between attorney and client. I also was thinking perhaps the fact that he was an officer, Matthew Farwell, perhaps he had some evidence about other cases on his work phone that they were going through. What would all of that look like with the privilege stuff to make sure they get everything absolutely correct?
So the way it works is if you are investigating a case and you're a prosecutor, you really have two sets of agents, and you have what we call a clean team. Those are the ones who are actually working on the case. Then you have a dirty team, or sometimes called a taint team. They're the ones that review the evidence in the first instance. So maybe it's a communication with a lawyer. Maybe it's a communication with his wife. Let's not forget he was married. His wife obviously was pregnant with their third child. Those communications may also be privileged under the marital privilege. And of course, if anything is related to another case, you want to make sure that that's excluded as well. So you're going to have the agents who are not involved with the case sift through everything in the first instance. That way, if they see something that's potentially privileged, it doesn't disqualify the case agents who are actually investigating the case. Because if you do see privileged material, usually the remedy is disqualification.
Something you brought up in the answer, which is huge in this case, is that Matthew Farwell was married. His wife actually gave birth to one of their children right around the time that Sandra Birchmore died. So to me, that's a huge motive in all of this. The fact that he was having an affair with Sandra Birchmore, she was pregnant, we believe, with his child. I know motive isn't something required to prove a case, but in this, it seems pretty strong to me. Do you think prosecutors are going to focus on that?
I think so. And you're absolutely right, Sierra. Motive is not an element of the crime, but jurors are ordinary people. And when they walk into that courtroom, they're going to ask, why would someone kill another human being? And here you have a pretty good reason. So you see that history, right, where Farwell's taken her virginity and all those text messages. And then years later, where she wants to become pregnant with his child. That's the compromise that they're talking about, right? And obviously, Farwell is certainly not happy, especially when his office, his police station, receives a phone call from Bridgemore's friend. So it's a big problem. And then you sort of have that motive. He's about to be outed to his wife, to his colleagues. He may lose his job. He may lose his family. And I think that's the motivation prosecutors are going to point to when they're making their case.
You mentioned this too, the fact that there's a really long timeline in this case. She was found dead in 2021. Now we're 2025, but we can go way back, I believe, to 2011 when she was just a teenager when they first met. And I'm wondering about all of that. Do you think the prosecution will establish the fact that they had this long-seated relationship, that she was underage when her virginity was taken by Farwell? I believe he was 27 and she was 15 at the time, which is obviously illegal. Are these things that the prosecution's really going to hammer home?
Absolutely, Sierra. And like you said, it really goes to the motive, but it also goes to dirty up Farwell. I mean, someone who's a police officer, who's 27 years old, who's having sex with a girl who's 15 years old, not just statutory rape, it's aggravated statutory rape, really abusing your position as a police officer. The jurors are going to absolutely hate him. And the text messages show even more the really sort of perverted sex that he was into. He would act like he was raping her, not just statutory rape, but actually violent rape as well. He would act like he was her brother and was forcing himself upon her. Really sick and twisted stuff, if you believe the text messages, which I do. I think the jurors aren't going to like him.
We've been talking a lot about the text messages, but honestly, that's a huge part of the case because we have the voices of both people who were involved. And I know we've learned a lot of this information from the affidavit. I mean, dozens of pages long, examples of their conversations and such. But do you think when this comes time for trial, there will be even more bombshells, so to speak, that are released, even more conversations or videos or photos that were on their cloud that are released by the prosecution to prove their point?
I think so, because in the digital age, right, especially with younger people, they're used to most of their communications being over the phone, right? It could be text messages, it could be FaceTime, voice notes, what have you. So I do expect there to be more. And in addition to that digital evidence, we know that the victim was talking to her friends and she was very excited to be a mother. So I'm sure, just like many young women all throughout the country, she was sharing that joy with others. That's when the whole suicide angle doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because it was pretty clear that she certainly wanted to have this baby.
You're right. There was a lot going on. I mean, she booked a photo shoot, a maternity one. I believe she wanted to have a gender reveal. And what you're saying, I believe, is accurate. The fact that she was talking to her friends and was excited for this baby. We even have in the affidavit, she took a photo announcing her pregnancy when she sent it to Matthew Farwell. So to me, it does seem like she was very excited. But of course, her death was originally ruled a suicide. And here's where the defense is coming in. I'm wondering if they're going to take the route, okay, the medical examiner got it right the first time back in 2021. They said that this was a suicide. Why are you guys changing your minds here? It was already ruled that way. Do you think they might bring all of that up?
I think so. I think the defense's argument is going to be as follows. This was absolutely a suicide. I think they're going to admit that the affair happened. They're going to say, listen, this was a sexual relationship. We're not denying it. It was inappropriate. Shouldn't have happened. At some point, Farwell told Bridgmore that he wasn't going to leave his wife, and that's what caused her to kill herself. I'm not saying I believe it, but that's where I expect the defense to go, because I think there's just too much evidence of the sexual activity to deny it outright. They're going to have some sort of explanation for why someone may want to kill themselves, and I think that's the direction they're going to go in.
How do you think they're going to explain all of that, though? Would they call on a medical expert to go through all of the information and say, yes, based on XYZ, I believe it actually was suicide rather than murder?
Yes, they're going to attack that medical causation. They're going to say that the examiner got it right the first time, and because of political pressure or whatever, they were forced to change their opinion. And you may see a battle of the experts. The first expert, of course, being the state's expert, being put on his or her toes because they obviously changed the conclusion from suicide to homicide. That's never good if you're the state. And of course, I'm sure the defense has had a lot of time to prepare. They're going to bring on an expert that is going to say that this was indeed a suicide, and the government got it all wrong.
We've talked a lot about timeline in this case because it goes back over a decade to when they first met, their lengthy relationship, 2021 when she was found dead, indictment 2024, and now here we are in 2025 when there's likely going to be this trial date. So a lot of time passage throughout all of this. Do you think this helps or hurts? Does it help in the way that we can establish this long relationship and we have a lot of texts and messages going way back? Or does it hurt in the fact that when she was found dead in 2021, everything, the evidence was collected then, but we can't go back and collect more evidence now? I mean, what do you think about the time passage?
I think time tends to help the prosecution. You have more evidence. Now, obviously, the time from the date of the murder to the date of trial, that hurts the prosecution. But the fact that you have this long lead up, and again, all the messages, I think it's going to be very difficult for the defense to get away from it, right? You have other potential charges here, right? You have the sexual activity, the statutory rape, which can be both state and federal. You have the fraud where Farwell is saying that he's on the clock, he's working, and is really having sex, at a Costco parking lot or a Five Guys parking lot. That's all also good for the state because, again, jurors aren't going to like a police officer that is lying, right? They may think, well, if he's lying about this, then maybe he's lying about everything, right? And that undermines his credibility. We talked about likability, but also credibility is really important in many criminal cases, even some civil ones, come down to likability and credibility. And I think the defense is at a big disadvantage here.
I think you're right that it's very tough in the fact that this man was an officer of the law, that when people are in emergencies, they would call him and hope that he would reply and that they could trust him. So I think the credibility and the likability is going to be huge in this case, something to definitely keep an eye on. You mentioned something else, though, too, the fact that this is a federal case, why we're talking to you today, but there weren't state charges that were originally filed in all of this. No murder, none of the sexual assault, none of all of that. Why do you think they kind of surpassed state and went right to federal?
Well, there's a couple reasons. First, you have the civil rights angle, right? Someone that's using their badge, their uniform to groom a young woman, a young girl, and have sex with them. That's a violation of civil rights under color of law. So that's a federal crime. The other reason is you have a police officer who killed a victim and a witness. That's also a federal crime. And the reality is that the state probably prosecutes a lot of cases on behalf of this police department, right? Well, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts here. So sometimes you'll have a conflict situation and you're going to kick the case over to really an agency that doesn't deal with them at all. There was some talk about this different case, obviously, but it's gotten a lot of attention there in Massachusetts, the Karen Reed case, right? Where maybe the feds should have stepped in and handled that case because, of course, the victim there was a police officer and there's an allegation of a police officer cover-up as well.
So I think you are right based on everything you just said. Here in Massachusetts, where I am, we have seen kind of a history of cases that are involving law enforcement that the Commonwealth will bring. So I think you're right. It might have been the right route for them to take the federal case route, so to speak. That also adds another layer too, because in the federal side of things, death penalty could be on the table. That isn't always the case within the state or the Commonwealth. What would those discussions look like for the prosecutors to decide whether they're going to go that route?
You're absolutely right, Sierra. I too am living in a blue state. I'm here in Los Angeles, and at least stateside, we have a moratorium on the death penalty, but that doesn't apply to our federal system. So it's always possible that federal prosecutors can bring a capital case. Now, here they would have to give notice, and too much time has passed. It's too late for that. So it's not really a possibility, but it certainly does change the calculus where you have a potential death penalty case on the table, because of course, the defense may take a deal just to save the defendant's life.
It's going to be interesting to see how all of that plays out. As of right now, we don't have a trial date set, but if you were just going to guess, do you think that's going to be sooner or later? What do you expect? Do you think it would be a lengthy trial if they don't have some sort of plea deal? What is your hypothesis?
I do think we're going to get a trial sooner rather than later for a few reasons. One, there was a trial date already set. Two, federal cases tend to move a lot faster. Judges just move through their dockets more quickly. And the defendant's in custody, right? So whenever you have someone that's in custody, sometimes it's hard for someone who's enjoying their freedom to voluntarily, set a trial date, because they may be looking at spending the rest of their life behind bars. But when you're in custody, that's a big motivating factor. So for instance, a case like Diddy, I think one of the reasons it's going to trial so quickly is because he wants to roll the dice and potentially get out, even though I don't think he will.
Yeah, we'll see when that trial date is set. I think you might be right. It could be sooner rather than later. Something we might see this year even. Nima Rahmani, thank you for coming on and walking us through this case.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm sure we'll be talking about this a lot more.
Matthew Farwell is due back in court on April 15th. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Sandra Gillespie.